I'm going to talk about today is about implementing change. So it's actually going to touch on a lot of what Aidan talked about earlier, because a lot of companies have that aspiration to have that culture, as intangible as it is, but there's kind of very obvious ways when you look at a company's culture, if it's the type of culture that you want, a generative type of culture, or if it's not. And in those more difficult ones, it's harder to make change happen. So I'm going to talk through a case study of trying to implement change and some of the challenges that I've faced. Okay, so I'm going to start with naivety, because that's probably the best place to start. So as I talked about at the start, working in Uxdx, we've kind of done a lot of research in what we feel the best practices of breaking down that barrier between the business and IT and getting the customer involved in the product delivery cycle. So when I started with Aer Lingus, I joined as a mobile program lead, and I thought, okay, my biggest challenge is going to be breaking down this business IT divide. So what I wanted to do was to get the product, UX, designers, all working together with our BAs, our developers, our QA, etc. So that's where I thought the main challenge was going to be. But then what we found was there were actually a lot of delivery challenges. So I've just drawn up a very simple technology stack. So I'm not sure how many people are kind of technical in the audience. Quick show of hands. Probably a third. So for those who aren't very technical, now this is a very simplified version, but you basically break down an IT stack into multiple layers. So you have the UI layer where the customers are interacting. You've got the services that give you a separation between your UIs, so you can reuse the same logic on your mobile app and your website, etc. Then you've got a messaging bus that connects to all your back-end systems, like an e-commerce system or your data warehouse or other third-party systems. Now, the challenge that we were facing was that when we were doing a project, you would do it full stack, so everything would be touched. And that's fine because you kind of have one team who's focusing on that. But the problem was we were never doing one project at the same time. There was about 50-something projects going on at the same time. So what was happening was that everybody was trying to touch the same bit of code at the same time. And this meant that we weren't able to go as quickly as we wanted to. And particularly from a UX perspective, when we're trying to enable the team to be doing experiments and testing things really quickly and getting things out. If I turned around to you and said, that's a great idea, it's a great experiment, I think I can get it out in about 4 months' time, it's not really enabling the quick learning and turnaround time that's needed. So the way I looked at it, there were 6 main constraints that were stopping us from releasing quickly. There's the obvious ones of the scope of what you're trying to do, the cost of it, that you can't go crazy on how much you're going to spend, and the resources, so a crude way of saying the people to do the work. But there were two ones that I wanted to focus on, which was the time constraint and the environment constraint. So with time, because we were touching the whole stack, it meant that you could only have one thing. There's only one version of your application in production, or in this architecture. So it meant that whenever a project was going through that path to production, you had to try and figure out where your window was. And your window was when one project finished testing and the next project starts testing. So you were just kind of looking at these huge spreadsheets trying to figure out where's the window that I can squeeze in a bit of work that I wanted to deliver. And as you can see in this example, this kind of a bit accurate, the windows weren't very common. The next one was around the environment. So the environment was built as a full stack again, which included the whole, it was based around the primary e-commerce platform of the company, which meant that whenever you wanted to work on something, you had to say, oh, well, I think I'm going to get this live based on my window at this point. So they'll go, okay, well, then you need to be on stack B because it's going to go live just before you, so you have to go onto that stack. But the problem then is that you're tied. So if they get delayed, if anything happens, well, you're moving along with them because you can no longer go ahead of them because you've now just introduced another constraint. So after trying to kind of come around with these things, I kind of reset, took a step back going, okay, my biggest challenge isn't going to be breaking down the customer, the business and IT divide. So what I did was I put on pause the change around that and said, okay, well, if I want to encourage that closer collaboration, I need to be able to say I can release quicker than 4 months. It just wasn't useful to keep working on that until we had fixed the delivery challenges. So the next section was kind of looking at it from a technical problem, because these issues that I've just been describing, they've been solved. A lot of companies have figured out how to break down systems, how to create isolation so that you don't have this kind of spaghetti code or this kind of everybody trying to touch the same thing. So what we did was we said, okay, well, how can we make the release windows smaller? If we make projects smaller, then they won't have as long durations, so you'll have more windows between them, because if you shrink the window, the duration, more gaps show up. So we were talking about, well, how about we implement a tax on long-running projects? Because the problem with it was, whenever we'd say, oh, we'll do all these releases, it became much more expensive. If I chopped a project in two, I had to pay twice to release it to production. And that was seen as, okay, well, now you're just increasing the cost. So we said, well, let's put in a tax to cover the hidden costs. That there are costs associated with the big projects, like change requests, the carrying costs of software that you've built but you haven't released. That could be generating money for the company. And other costs of blocking, like I said, merging, etc. But that was rejected because it was seen to be just it's going to make us look more expensive. So we don't want to do that. So then we said, okay, well, let's look at the architecture. And if we could start making a domain-driven architecture approach, what we can do then is we can isolate bits of code out. So instead of having every project touching everything, if we start implementing different domains, you could have one project touching domain A, another project domain C, and they're completely independent then, that they don't need to interact with each other. So a lot of work has been done on that, and designs have come up, but it was, oh, that's going to take years to do, so we're not able to solve that straight away. And then we're like, okay, well, that environment problem that I talked about, that if I lock into an environment and then it delays, I'm caught by that as well. Well, how about we swap our way of looking at things, and we go, everything, all of our kind of UI-facing stuff sits on our production application, and anything where we're changing our e-commerce platform, that's a separate environment. So that will become the production application at some point, but at the moment, all I'm concerned about is making sure that when it changes, my services don't need to change, as in the interaction with the website, etc. It doesn't need to change. But again, that was rejected because it's a lot of hard work. And the release windows finally saying, okay, well, let's shrink the path to production. So if we can't change the project size, let's shrink how long it takes to get it out. So we went to the teams and we said, okay, well, here's a challenge for you guys. It's taking a long time. Come back with solutions that you have, because the people closest to the problem are often the people who know the best ways of fixing it. So they came up with lots of ideas and started working on it. But then it became overruled because the structures internally were saying, well, we can't have different ways of working in one team versus another team. So we either have to agree the whole company shifts to a new way of working, or everybody stays with the same way of working. So the way I picture this is I was taking logic to an emotional argument. So I was trying to explain with logic, saying, okay, here's problems, here's solutions, let's do it. I thought logic was going to be enough to convince people. But emotion is what actually triggers people to change behavior. It's not logic. There's kind of two main aims. Like, you have to motivate people to do it, but then you have to make it easy for them to do it. So moving on from it's a technical problem, it's a people problem. So the next few steps is kind of, there's a guy in Stanford who has a behavioral model that he says, basically, if you want to change behavior, you need motivation. So that's your logic. That's your kind of your data that shows that this is a better way of working. But that alone isn't enough. You also need the ability. You need to make it easy for people to change if you want them to actually take on board something new. So the way I looked at it was, okay, well, the triple constraint was kind of the core thing here. Now, I don't know, this is probably more of a waterfall type organization, where the triple constraint being you have budget, cost, scope, and you have to keep your quality constrained. So the question that I just kept asking was, well, what if an on-time, on-budget project does not deliver on the expected benefits? Is that still a success? So people were gradually kind of coming over to, okay, well, it's not, but again, it's still back in the logics kind of motivational side. It's not doing anything on ability. And the question that kept coming back to me was, okay, well, teach us this agile process, and then we'll go and adopt this agile process across the whole company. Again, everybody has to do it or nobody does it. So I kept having the conversation going, well, there is no one agile process. Agile is an evolution from waterfall to, as teams get more mature, they can break down silos between teams and take on more responsibility. So it's kind of just showing that there is a lot of different variations of Agile as you get towards, and as I would say, this would be my preference, where you have the business, IT, everybody working in cross-functional teams with a mission in order to solve that. So this started getting some conversations. Okay, so maybe we can't go to this all or nothing. Maybe there is the need to have different processes in different teams depending on the maturity of those teams. But what really happened was it impacted against people's core beliefs. So what I have on the left is what traditional or Taylorist approach to management, where he was the father of science, the management science, and he came up with the concept that by breaking companies into functions, it's the most efficient way of working. So that's where you have your sales function, your marketing function, your IT function, your customer services. Because in a low change environment, that is the most efficient way to structure a company. And in the early 20th century, it was a low change environment. Things weren't changing rapidly. The challenge is when software development came along, we introduced a new paradigm that hadn't been seen before. We're never in a low change environment. We're constantly changing. So if you want to optimize for responsiveness over cost efficiency, you actually have to do things almost the polar opposite of the way you've done them before. And if you've worked for 20 years in a particular way of working, it's quite jarring to hear or learn that this might not be the most optimal way of working. So then, realizing that there was this kind of jarring nature of people, and people are going to push back against that, it was how do we align management? Because there's only so much you can do from a bottom-up, get the teams involved. You need to make sure that there's top-down buy-in as well. So what we did was we got a vision for the organization that everybody could get behind. So the vision was that, jumping ahead of myself, Conway's Law. So the challenge is if you want to change a processes get locked in by the way the company is structured. There's a guy called Conway who coined a law that says any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So if you think about how your company works, between silos, there often is a documentation handover because that's the most efficient way of each person in the silo making sure that their area is constrained. They have entry criteria. I'll only take in work if you meet these conditions. So what happens is if you have a functional structure, you end up in a waterfall process because each of the functions will define strict entry criteria and exit criteria. So you'll have a document handing between each of the functions. So if you want to go to a cross-functional team, you have to shift it on its axis, put in place a cross-functional product, and have different representatives from across the organization. So we needed to get buy-in at a management level that we needed to do this shift from a traditional functional approach to the more product-structured approach. And kind of in reading a lot about change management, there's two ways that you can do change. There's the crisis, where it's kind of people's survival anxiety overrules their learning anxiety. So they go, okay, well, I have to do this even if it's scary, because otherwise I'm out of a job. Or it's leadership, where you try to increase their ability to learn so that it's easier to learn than the scare of survival. So we went down the leadership approach, and that's where this vision comes in. So it was the vision from management was that we do want to go towards that responsive way of working. We want to be continuously optimizing towards a rapid and sustainable flow of value. So it was really embedding, okay, we want to move towards responsive instead of the cost-efficient approach. So now up to the teams to figure out how to do it. And what we did in one of our teams was we did a trial run, because if you come back to that problem we had at the start of, well, teams can't do things differently. If I'm managing a function, the most efficient way of doing that is if everybody does it the same way, so I can move people in and out of jobs quickly. So we said, well, if we're shifting to this product structure, then the different teams are going to work in different ways, depending on their own circumstances. So we did a trial run, and we said, look, what's the worst that can happen? Let's do 3 months of working in this new way. Let's see what happens. Let's measure any improvement that we get. and we'll take it from there. So that was how we kind of got management on board. To get the team on board, we said, well, what's our process? So we sat down with the team and said, okay, well, that's our vision, that we want to get to this really responsive way of working. How does that work in practice? So we sat down with the team, and we came up with a very long process flow. But what happened was there was no separation between functions in this flow. It was actually one team working together. Communication was happening a lot. There was a lot of, basically a lot of the documentation disappeared. Sorry. And then what we did was we said, okay, well, that's our ideal, that's our blue sky, but we're down here at the moment. So how do we get there? So we started identifying the gaps and started doing small experiments to try figure out, well, what's the biggest problems we're facing? Let's do something quick and small, figure out whether that works. So doing change management in the same way that you would do product development. Small iterations, see what happens, learn from your mistakes, and move on. And that's where we are, happily ever after. So everything worked, nothing went wrong, and it was a great success. So the way I would describe it is, there's a great, I copied this from, there's a great illustration of different management structures. This one I think is apt, because to those people that we said, let's do a trial run, well, they're losing authority, they're losing control and power. In a lot of organizations, power is determined by how many people you have under your direct control. So if you say, well, let's shift from you being at the top here to you being at the side, and you're more of an influencer rather than a direct manager, that's taking power away from people, and they're not going to like that. So there is a little bit of tension. It's being worked through, but it does exist. And then on the team level, so purpose and mastery are definitely coming on. So we've identified the purpose and what the teams are trying to achieve. We've worked on that in both the purpose of how we work as well as the purpose of why we work, so the business objectives of what we're doing. Mastery is coming along through moving towards that new way of working, because there's a lot of new techniques that people need to do to work closer and change how they're working. Relatedness is probably the one that still needs a bit of work. So if you ask people their team, they will still say their function. But what we want to do is get them to see the product as their team versus the function. So I'll finish with saying if you are in this position where you're trying to influence change, it can feel like it's really slow going. It's best I keep track of some of the wins to keep motivation high, because it feels like you are battling against kind of uphill. But yeah, just keep going. You'll get there in the end. So thank you very much.